Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank.
A very warm welcome, dear viewers, to this edition of Mena-Watch Talks. Today, with roles reversed, Thomas von der Osten-Sacken joins us again. He's in Frankfurt this time. I'm the one traveling, but that shouldn't detract from our conversation. So first of all, a warm welcome, Thomas. Thank you so much for taking the time again.
Hello.
Yes, the topic of our conversation is, who would have thought, once again, the situation in and around Iran? So we currently have this memorandum of understanding. It's often referred to as a deal, but truthfully, it can't really be considered a deal in any sense of the word. What exactly is this memorandum that we're dealing with right now?
That's a good question. It's kind of a declaration of intent, meant to lay the groundwork for further negotiations, isn't it? And the only true statement, the real statement in this document, as far as I understand it, is that during the 60 days of continued negotiations, the Strait of Hormuz will be opened for all traffic. However, just this morning, a ship was reportedly fired upon by the Iranians once more, allegedly for not adhering to the specific shipping lane they had designated. That certainly doesn't exactly signify an open Strait of Hormuz, does it? It suggests anything but a free flow of passage.
Yes, maybe we should clarify this for our viewers. Today is June 26th. It's around noon, so that's what the statement refers to, something happened today, whenever you happen to be watching this video later. Yes. Is this essentially more than just an extension of the ceasefire that was already in place? Is it truly more than that, sweetened by the Americans for the Iranians with sanctions relief and what seems like billions in commitments? Yet it remains entirely unclear where all that money is actually supposed to come from.
Yes, I mean, the ceasefire, which we've discussed before, wasn't actually a ceasefire at all, as fighting continued the whole time. So, in the traditional sense, a ceasefire is something different from what was happening between the Iranians and the US. And this memorandum of understanding, it is in principle someone at the Atlantic actually wrote about it quite accurately. It is, in essence, a declaration of surrender, and it's quite telling, isn't it, that Donald Trump chose to sign it in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, a place that, for us Europeans, unequivocally conjures up images of capitulation, whether we're thinking of 1871 or 1919. And against such a historical backdrop, it becomes incredibly difficult to determine what this document can truly be compared with. And even in conservative media circles, especially within the United States, the prevailing sentiment and general consensus is that this unequivocally represents an admission of defeat, a declaration of surrender by the US. I wouldn't describe it in such dramatic terms, but it is highly significant that no one, with the sole exception of Donald Trump, is even suggesting that this document represents a partial victory or provides any foundation for progress with Iran. On the contrary, it's essentially, yes, a synonym for raising the white flag, especially after holding a completely superior military position. I mean, it's not as if the US lost this war in any military sense. They were battling a fourth-rate regional power, enjoying absolute military dominance, and now their behavior suggests they're desperately attempting to extricate themselves from this whole situation without completely losing face in the process. And that is ultimately just utterly absurd. It becomes incredibly difficult to even reflect on it in analytical terms, trying to understand the actual purpose behind it all.
I get the impression that Trump isn't even attempting to do that anymore. Occasionally he'll still mention, yes, there's no Air Force remaining and no Navy either. That might be true, but it's totally beside the point. I mean, essentially winning a military war and then capitulating without any resistance is quite. I genuinely can't think of a single other instance like it. That's a relatively unique situation, isn't it?
I think so too. I would also say we're seeing that for Trump, this war is now just a nuisance and it's over. We're moving on to the next topic now. It's also quite fascinating that, let's just say, the fervent dedication with which one speaks about the reflecting pool is almost energetically greater than that for the Iran war. It's also very telling that for these negotiations in Switzerland, he sends his vice president, who is actually a very uninfluential person in the US. So the vice president in the US is traditionally a bit of an unimportant figure, wouldn't you say? For such incredibly important high-stakes negotiations, one truly ought to send their Secretary of State, a seasoned diplomat, or even go in person. Instead, they dispatched a vice president who is utterly green, completely lacking in foreign policy experience, and who, frankly, behaves as if he's putting on some ludicrous, almost comical performance straight out of a Groucho Marx routine. I mean, you just sit there now. It all has something incredibly comical about it if it weren't so tragic. I mean, for J.D. Vance to stand up and declare, wow, we've achieved a complete breakthrough. The inspectors from the IAEA will be returning to Iran. They're the ones who... They had departed from Iran because Trump had revoked Obama's previous accord. And then we called, but nobody picked up. That's no surprise. At 2 in the morning, you just don't pick up the phone. So the US Vice President, calling from Switzerland, contacts an inspector of the International Atomic Energy Agency at 2 in the morning, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to say, hey, you guys can come back to Iran. So that's comical. That's satire. And you can see from the images coming out of Switzerland that nobody takes him seriously. There are Pakistanis, Qataris, Iranians who all know, at least formally, how to behave in such negotiations and on the international stage, and amidst them stands J.D. Vance. Vance, like some kind of, like a schoolboy, with whom everyone is already communicating through their body language, we simply do not take this man seriously at all. And then the next thing, yesterday, Vance declares in this sort of, in this schoolyard tone, we're now also setting up a direct communication line between CENTCOM, the American headquarters, and the Revolutionary Guards. The Revolutionary Guards are currently on the US terrorist list. So, in the past, when there were negotiations with the US and its avowed enemies, the CIA would conduct them discreetly behind closed doors, hoping to keep them out of the public eye. And in this case, J.D. Vance announces it to the world press. One simply runs out of words, as I said, to truly grasp and comprehend the sheer insanity of the entire situation.
And this is once again a typical case for the Trump administration, or the way he runs his government or doesn't run it. This announced lifting of sanctions, specifically all US sanctions against the Iranian regime, seems once again to be simply and entirely legally impossible. You said it, the Revolutionary Guards are an organization officially designated as a terrorist entity in the United States. They simply cannot, at this moment, permit or put into effect any sanctions or engage in business dealings with an association that has been officially designated as a terrorist organization.
Plus, a large part of these are congressional sanctions. Congress has to lift them, the president can't. Some of those are actually UN sanctions. So, But it really doesn't matter at all anymore. The problem is, at this point, it absolutely doesn't matter, not even slightly. It truly doesn't matter what anyone says anymore. You can't even hold any of these American politicians accountable or pin them down on something they might have said just 2 or 3 months prior. That's also completely irrelevant. Ultimately, I really get the impression that we are genuinely living in a virtual reality of sorts, where reality, as we have always known it, actually plays absolutely no role at all. So, events such as a UFC cage fight or the bungled renovation of that peculiar reflecting pool are addressed and deliberated upon in precisely the same manner and with the same level of discourse as a genuinely critical question like the fact that a war has been waged against Iran. It is about the Iranian nuclear program, about equipping terrorist organizations, proxy militias ultimately. It's about the future of the Middle East. But the way it's being discussed, it's as if it's about nothing at all, just some insignificant self-created event.
Well, I mean, the real problem is that aside from all the absurdities unfolding in the White House and other places, an actual reality still very much exists. And it simply won't be impressed, and it's located in the Middle East. And that includes, among other things, the situation between Israel and Hezbollah. So, as is well known, Iran is making every effort to connect these two fronts, Iran and Lebanon, claiming that whenever Israel does anything in Lebanon, it's immediately a breach of the ceasefire, even though Israel was not involved in any way, shape, or form. Do you genuinely believe that such a thing could actually work? Do you truly think that the pressure from the United States on Israel could be powerful enough, even if they desired it, to prevent any Israeli action against Hezbollah?
Well, that would, in the end, lead to the dissolution of the US-Israeli alliance or something similar because I believe this transcends the entirety of the dysfunctional Netanyahu government and its policies. So if you, so to speak, prohibit the Israelis from defending themselves against Hezbollah rocket attacks, you indirectly question Israel's right to exist, or at the very least, that of the people living in northern Israel. Furthermore, you would be granting Hezbollah a level of power and influence that they have never before possessed. Moreover, the truly absurd thing is that at this very moment, the Lebanese government finds itself just as discontent with this entire policy as Israel does. There are very explicit statements from high-ranking Lebanese politicians who, though not condoning Israel's actions in southern Lebanon, acknowledge a historical opportunity existed to disarm and weaken Hezbollah. However, they argue that this MOU re-strengthens them, elevating Hezbollah into an exceptionally vital and influential factor within Lebanon. The entire strategy to weaken Hezbollah is, in fact, failing. And in Lebanon, after painstaking attempts to weaken its influence, Iran has once again risen to become the pivotal game changer. This is because the decision rests squarely with Iran, determining whether Hezbollah launches rockets or not. We are aware of this. Due to all this peculiar diplomacy, Iran has the power to close the Strait of Hormuz whenever it wishes. They already know that now. That's something they didn't know before. Now they are aware of the potent weapon they possess in their hands. They can at any given time induce Hezbollah or even the Houthis to start launching rockets, and now, furthermore, they can anticipate the US reaction to be, oh, it's merely a rocket, it just fell somewhere in a remote, uninhabited field. Don't make such a fuss, and please don't shoot back because you're jeopardizing our diplomacy with Iran. And what's more, this was officially a coalition between the US and Israel, which they had proudly announced to the world. When you wage a coalition war and then engage in ceasefire negotiations, you do so as a unified coalition, not by unilaterally excluding your ally from the discussions. And the US did just that. So it's understandable Israel feels unbound by this strange MOU. They weren't involved in its drafting.
Yeah, as you've stated, the whole situation is completely strange and bizarre. So for the first time in decades, Lebanon is at least willing to push back against Hezbollah. To massively push back, possibly expose it, and then eliminate it. And then Trump rides in, with J.D. Vance by his side, essentially saving Hezbollah's existence or ensuring its presence in Lebanon. What I don't understand about this is why... Well, you said it. None of this can be rationally analyzed anymore. But why is this game of threats exclusively left up to the Iranian side? So, why is it that Iran can step up and boldly declare that any Israeli attack on Hezbollah constitutes a breach of the ceasefire, which they then intend to sanction? Why does the US completely give up this possibility and hand it over? They could easily say, Hezbollah's attack on Israel breaks the ceasefire and Iran will be held accountable, but no one seems to consider that.
Nope, I can't answer that question for you because it's absurd. I mean, right now you just need to read the slightly, let's say, right-leaning Israeli press, which just months ago was really euphoric about this war and the alliance, and now, finally, after Trump, they're completely disillusioned and heartbroken. I mean, all you hear now is Neville Chamberlain, appeasement, betrayal, and so on, and that Trump has completely lost his mind. And this isn't coming from some critical left-wing voices, no, this is directly from Israel Hayom, a publication owned by Mrs. Adelson, who is in fact one of the biggest donors to Trump's presidential campaign. So in Israel, people are completely horrified by what's happening, completely detached from all the political conflicts, disputes, and polarization because it neither corresponds to any comprehensible rationality, nor if this development continues, it massively jeopardizes the security of Israel's security massively in question. This means a war they had tirelessly worked towards, feeling it was absolutely necessary, investing tremendous effort, particularly in intelligence preparation and so on, over a span of many years. In its current effect, this war has ironically become almost worse for Israel than it was on February 27th, even regarding its entire international standing and positioning. And all this after 6 straight weeks of Iran being systematically bombed, it has transpired. You just mentioned it. I seriously can't recall a single instance in history where someone managed to lose a war they had already won, quite like this.
It would be as if NATO had surrendered after the air war against Serbia.
Yeah, or if they had said afterward that Kosovo will now become an integral part of Serbia and will pay Serbia another 20 billion in reconstruction aid, and on top of that, because Russia wants it, we'll make sure Poland, the Czech Republic, and Slovakia don't join NATO, something like that.
Yeah. What else is there to say? Let's revisit the topic for a moment, because one of the reasons for the war, or at least as Trump himself officially stated, remains this Iranian nuclear weapons program. But that, like regime change or human rights in Iran, is now off the table. I mean, it's not even mentioned in this memorandum. Supposedly, it's going to be discussed somehow in the next 60 days, but since the Iranians have already gotten everything they wanted, there's absolutely no reason for them to make any more compromises. They know perfectly well the US isn't willing to start the war again, so why would they compromise on anything?
Yeah, I see it the same way. And not just the nuclear program. The second thing was Iran's long-range missiles, because supposedly the nuclear program was already completely destroyed last July. So it was always a bit strange back in February that it suddenly wasn't destroyed after all. And then the focus shifted heavily to these missiles. Rightfully so, the ones we identified as a real problem during the war, the ones that reached as far as Diego Garcia. And Trump then just declared that Iran should also have some missiles because the Saudis already have a few, and if Iran doesn't have any, it's really just not fair. So, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, one completely loses sight of all this stuff by now, doesn't one? One more point on the topic of the Iranian nuclear program. It's often stated now, or frequently observed in analyses of this Memorandum of Understanding, that this is essentially a new edition of the 2015 nuclear deal. That's actually one point where I'd have to disagree, because the significant difference is that back in 2015, when Obama signed that Vienna Agreement, all of Iran's nuclear program infrastructure remained completely intact. All the uranium enrichment plants, the heavy water reactor in Iraq, and all of that just remained as they were, and at best, if anything, they were only slightly altered or modified. That's quite different now. The Iranian nuclear program, regardless of one's views on the war, has effectively been set back by many years, if not decades, simply due to the vanished physical infrastructure. This is indeed a significant difference that certainly warrants recognition.
Yes, but in exchange, Iran now has the Strait of Hormuz. So if we try to briefly recap what exactly Iran needed a nuclear program for, right? Then there are two factors. Two calculations. The first one is in the style of North Korea. If we possess the bomb, then militarily we can no longer be defeated, or rather, we become invincible. The second calculation is the Islamist apocalyptic perspective, where having the bomb would allow them to eradicate Israel, wouldn't it? The first has a certain rationality to it, the other is ideological madness. For the first one, Iran no longer needs a bomb because the nation has now been handed the capability, the power to close the Strait of Hormuz whenever it deems fit, whenever it suits its purposes. The economic fallout is far, far more devastating than if Iran had dropped an atomic bomb. One must indeed say this quite cynically. You know, like this. And the manner in which the US dealt with it clearly demonstrated to the entire world that despite having the largest navy on Earth, we are utterly incapable of ensuring that the Strait of Hormuz remains open. At most, we can impose a secondary blockade there. And so, this has now become a completely integral part of Iran's foreign policy strategy. They're making that clear too. So 60 days, and after that, we'll start levying passage tolls or passage fees for all ships. Iran stated that.
They call them processing fees or something along those lines, yeah.
We'll do that with Oman, and as soon as something doesn't suit us, we'll fire on a ship or close the Strait of Hormuz. So then you don't need nuclear weapons as a deterrent anymore. Then the Strait of Hormuz will suffice, right? So the second objective, the declared goal of every Iranian government of the Islamic Republic of Iran, is the short, medium, and long-term annihilation of Israel. That doesn't have to be with an atomic bomb. If it can be done another way, that's fine too. So, from a strategic calculus perspective, the current regional strengthening of Iran, which primarily represents a complete weakening of the US, is quite appealing. This is because for such a long time, it appeared as though Iran's crucial allies near Israel's borders, namely Assad, Hezbollah, and Hamas, were being progressively weakened, meaning Iran would no longer have access through them. Meaning Assad, Hezbollah, Hamas would be so weakened that Iran would no longer have access through them. That was always a really crucial and important policy, you know. In Syria, you can see what a difference it makes who is in power in Damascus. Currently, it appears that Hezbollah will somehow survive this conflict, even maintaining its status as an armed group. And there's absolutely no indication that Hamas in Gaza. By the way, today there was a mobilization for large mass demonstrations by Palestinians, specifically against Hamas. We'll see what comes of that Hamas will disappear. The Houthis are sitting there untouched with all their weapons on the Red Sea. This means that if billions of dollars are actually released now, which I personally don't currently foresee happening, then Iran can also, quite calmly and at its leisure, begin to re-equip and strengthen all its satellite forces once again without any issues. And on the international stage, Iran has achieved one of its goals. Israel has truly rarely been as isolated as it is at this very moment. So the support for Israel on the international stage is currently so low as it's really been in a very, very long time. And the domestic political situation in Israel is extremely unstable. Elections are coming, it's unclear how they'll turn out, society is totally polarized. 3 years of war have truly exacted their massive toll, psychologically, economically, and so forth. Thus, the paramount question becomes, considering its twin objectives, which I have outlined as external deterrence and the annihilation of the Zionist entity, could Iran, from its present circumstances, conceivably devise a strategy wherein it concludes that the atomic bomb holds significantly less importance than it did a mere decade ago?
But there's another goal, I would say, that was also achieved, at least on paper, because the Iranian regime has always been concerned about its own survival, last but not least. And this notable memorandum of understanding, after all, stipulates an agreement to abstain from mutual meddling in internal affairs. This means that in the future, any reference by the United States to the suppression of protest in Iran or any protest against the human rights situation in Iran would be considered a violation of the ceasefire. I genuinely believe the Iranians couldn't have ever dreamed that they would one day receive this, presented to them in black and white by the Americans. I mean, anyone would have declared that idea completely insane.
So, this memorandum of understanding does something significant, addressing an issue that almost every previous American administration has consistently avoided and shirked. So, this memorandum officially recognizes the Islamic Republic of Iran quite officially as the Islamic Republic. And it explicitly acknowledges that this Islamic Republic, in the true spirit of the Peace of Westphalia, exerts sovereign control over its territory. This unequivocally encompasses any form of persecution of political opponents, the forceful suppression of protests, and all similar actions. This explicitly and very clearly incorporates all of that into its phrasing. And that, in fact, has never truly occurred before, because it's always been said that, well, actually, we're attempting to somewhat skirt around and evade this very specific point, you see. So, from dear Iranian protesters, help is on the way and regime change is coming, to dear Iranian government, you can do whatever you want with your people in your country. We won't interfere, all in 4 months.
Yes, and you mentioned earlier that there's significant criticism in the US, even in conservative circles. And someone, among others, in, I believe it was the National Review, criticized it, pointing out precisely this issue. This empowerment, or rather the complete entrenchment of the Iranian regime, was unequivocally the aim of Obama's 2015 nuclear deal. Yet back then, the entire affair remained in some formal way tied to the nuclear issue, which has now been totally set aside and is completely disregarded. Now, it's just the pure in black and white empowerment of the Iranian regime that has happened with this memorandum.
In a certain way, yes, right? Plus, of course, there's the hope that if one appeases the Iranians, something economically beneficial will result, and that they will eventually show gratitude, which, as we all know, they won't. This kind of hope is frankly quite naive given the historical context and the nature of the regime. And of course, this has absolutely devastating consequences for all of America's traditional allies beyond just Israel. So today, Pete Hegseth's Department of Defense, or, as he put it, War Department, reported they are contemplating withdrawing troops and other personnel from Bahrain. And Bahrain and Qatar are considering it because that's where the American troops are stationed, right? The United Arab Emirates had portrayed themselves as the principal hawks throughout this conflict, and now they too appear foolish and are attempting to reorient their strategy. The Saudis, who during the war had tried to somewhat maintain a stance of neutrality, are now, in a sense, renegotiating their overall position in the Middle East. In Iraq, the factions within the Iraqi government that have been insisting on finally integrating these Shiite militias into the military have now been weakened. So these are also all the extensive regional consequences, completely separate from the Israeli-Lebanese conflict. The United States, to quote Mao, appears to be a paper tiger, unreliable and seemingly incapable of truly fulfilling its promises of protection. These promises have been de facto guaranteed in the Gulf, at the very latest since 1991, with an immense military presence, but now they prove impossible to implement. And so, the US is drastically losing influence throughout the region because that was their essential role, wasn't it? I mean, in Kurdistan we even wondered why they were still in Erbil. So what exactly is the future purpose, the very meaning of US troops being stationed in northern Iraq? Especially if one is not capable of... To win a war against Iran, you can pretty much just withdraw. So this insane tectonic shift from we're now waging the war everyone's been anticipating for 15 years to we're going to back down in 4 months. Of course, no one has processed or truly digested that in any way. Instead, people are sitting utterly bewildered in Kuwait, in Abu Dhabi, in Riyadh, in Amman, and so forth, asking themselves what exactly was that all about? This will have very, very fundamental, I believe, medium and long-term consequences, truly affecting the significant role the US historically played and was compelled to assume in the Middle East, particularly after the British, following the Suez Crisis and the broader process of decolonization, essentially relinquished their role as the primary stabilizing power. Or however one wishes to phrase it, effectively ceding it to the US, and once the US steps back, there's nobody left. Right, and then the significant regional competition comes back into play once more. Who takes on this role? Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, we know. No single one is strong enough on its own, but they can cause incredible problems for the others, so it never ends. That's one of those little games that's been played for decades there in the Middle East. And whenever these little games became too intense, the US had always stepped in and put a stop to them. However, the US under Trump is no longer the power that can intervene, or am I wrong about that?
No, not at all. And I mean, it's also one of the suggestions, as I said earlier, you can easily lose track of things, but one of Trump's truly brilliant proposals after he essentially presented Lebanon to Iran on a silver platter was this. Well, perhaps the Syrians in Lebanon could now undertake the disarmament of Hezbollah. I mean, seriously, how historically clueless can you be to even propose to Lebanon that it would be a fantastic idea for the Syrians to just march right back in? It's utterly unfathomable, truly unbelievable.
Yes, or now Turkey. I mean, Erdogan is currently systematically dismantling the CHP. Systematically. So in Turkey, we're witnessing the final push towards authoritarianism, a move that was quite evidently very carefully and meticulously prepared. You know, and then Trump declares Erdogan is a good buddy and we're going to deliver a whole bunch of fighter jets because Turkey is a great ally of ours. So those are the signals coming out of Washington at the moment. And of course, I mean, the crucial point is after January and February, and I've truly never been a proponent of European Iran policy, quite the opposite, in fact, but the manner in which this war has been fought has certainly provided the Europeans with a super convenient exit strategy, hasn't it? So you tell all the Europeans they're a bunch of fools, you don't involve them, and so on and so forth, and today they're all just sitting there saying, well, there you have it, that's your issue, not ours. So, with a slight smile on our faces, we'll mediate the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding in the Hall of Mirrors. Otherwise, it's really not our problem. And so, with that, what we have always criticized, where at least in the past, under Obama or even Bush, there was always an attempt to form coalitions with either all the Europeans or with certain European countries, and to proceed together, well, that simply no longer applies now. That entire approach has completely vanished. We always forget how big the 2003 coalition was, or with Iran. That's totally gone, meaning Europeans were once slammed as passive, seeking dialogue, boosting Iran's regime, and Trump made it a morally superior position, so Europeans can say, we were smarter, we stayed out of the war, it ended up in an even worse state than it was before. So it was quite sensible of us not to engage in that. And with that, even more potential pressure is lifted from Iran because the EU and Europe would move heaven and earth before getting involved with Iran in any way, shape, or form.
Yeah, in our conversations, or at least in one or two of them, we talked about how much longer it would take until we could meet for a coffee in Tehran. That date, so to speak, will have to postpone for the foreseeable future, or do I see that incorrectly?
Well, all I can say, the Middle East, nothing is predictable, okay? I mean, we also didn't know that you could have a coffee in Tunis. Well, you always could in Tunis or in Benghazi or in Damascus. So up until now, we've only really discussed the foreign policy implications, so to speak. The situation in Iran is catastrophic, even though the entire Iranian opposition, of course, has been utterly disappointed by their initial assumption of having allies in the US and must now completely restructure. However, Iran has not emerged domestically as the significant victor here. Rather, all the underlying issues that initially sparked these protests have only escalated and worsened, showing no signs of improvement in the immediate future. This means we simply have the same old situation. A regime that's completely done for and utterly past its prime has relatively successfully endured a conflict with both the great and little Satan. But domestically, it won't be able to change anything about the catastrophic economic, social, political situation. So in that regard, we find ourselves right back to the very beginning, in the exact same state of affairs as before February 27th of February, that something significant will eventually occur in Iran. We just don't know when. We only know that this time it won't be with American support. So that basic assumption has changed, you see.
Right, but isn't it the billion-dollar gift that the Americans promised the Iranian regime, plus the lifting of sanctions, plus all of these things?
All that has to happen first. I mean, between a promise and, Trump also wanted to impose massive tariffs on all sorts of things and couldn't do it in the end. Thus, we are also observing that this particular US administration currently appears to be utterly lacking in its sovereign capabilities. It's essentially no longer operating. It truly doesn't possess the same impetus it had back in January concerning Venezuela. Everyone can plainly see it's quite clearly on the ropes, you know. We don't know what the midterms will bring. On the other hand, these negotiations will drag on for months. Iran can. Iran will do the devil's work before agreeing to any binding result before. How long did that Obama deal take? 2 years? That joint thing agreement, they negotiated 2 years, right?
Yes, with 2 interim agreements and so on, yes.
Right. So the US idea that we'll do all this very quickly to get out of there fast isn't going to work. The saga in the Middle East continues, and in that respect, I think, yes, our hopes of drinking coffee in Tehran in April have completely evaporated into thin air. We must persist in contemplating how can we, with our constrained resources, persistently stand in solidarity and bolster the Iranian opposition, both within and outside the country, who are undeniably utterly frustrated, because the objective of toppling the regime remains paramount, irrespective of any pronouncements emanating from Washington. And as I mentioned, you really always have to keep in mind just how quickly something like this can happen in unstable countries. You're sitting in Croatia right now, 2 countries over, in Albania 4 weeks ago. No one would have imagined that 1 million Albanians would take to the streets, all thanks to Trump's son-in-law and his daughter. And today, with all this talk of a flamingo revolution, it's still a big question just how much longer this Mr. Rama will remain seated in his presidential palace. So the other side is always trying to make us believe that there's some kind of stability, that everything is now set in stone and permanently cemented in place for the next 5 years. And it's always quite important to remember that the last 2 decades have in fact presented us with a multitude of entirely different developments as well. As I said, this is a tiny glimmer of hope, and I believe it's our responsibility, using our journalistic or organizational or whatever means available, to state clearly, the only viable option in Iran is the overthrow of this current regime. And one must hold fast to that goal, even if, at this very moment, those who initially articulated this objective as the sole correct path have been terribly diminished and find themselves on the defensive.
Yes, especially because there's even more to it. We've talked about this before. I mean, aside from all these bombastic idiocies that Trump spouts, there's also a clear reality. And I believe it was once again in the National Review that someone wrote, yes, but regardless of what Trump claims or doesn't claim, or what he does or doesn't do, the geopolitical causes of this conflict between the Iranian regime and the US, none of them have been eliminated. All of those elements still remain now, just as they did before. And at some point, the weight of the geopolitical factors that led to this conflict will simply come to bear again. It truly doesn't matter, not at all, what Trump does or what other idiocies will emerge in the coming months.
The interesting thing is, and to draw that parallel again since I've been to Albania twice, the interesting thing is, a country like Albania, which is more or less the poorest country in Europe, right? Where people are genuinely demonstrating for democracy, for a responsible government, for the separation of powers, and they're doing it in part with Uncle Sam. Because Albania is, I believe, the most pro-American country I've ever visited. Where they also make it abundantly clear, this is against the Trump family, but we just believe in the American promise of happiness, and that's what we truly want, you know. So it's been quite similar in Iran, across all the various polls conducted there. I see this across all the Middle Eastern countries I visit. This younger generation, we've discussed it countless times, simply desires something different. And unlike the elites in Washington, Berlin, or Vienna, they absolutely have not given up on the belief or the hope for greater freedom, for true democratization, for the rule of law. On the contrary, that very topic consistently resurfaces as a crucial point of discussion and remains a vital issue, doesn't it? This, in a way, kind of offers a glimmer of hope because, as I've mentioned, it's constantly happening in various nations, and we're seeing it globally now. Anyone who's protesting in the streets is striving for something that is absolutely worthy of our support.
Yeah, and there's something quite positive or even uplifting about that. If at least someone still holds faith in the American promise, even when the present-day US itself has given up on it.
Exactly. And it so happened to be some Albanian farmers brandishing US flags and an Uncle Sam chanting, "We want democracy." I don't know if you saw those images, but they're literally laying waste to the construction site for this luxury resort, reducing it to rubble, just tearing it down, you know. But with the American flag and "We want democracy" with Uncle Sam, I find that very appealing.
Well, I think we can call it a day, at least for our discussion today. We've definitely had more pleasant discussions, I'd say, but I'm confident there will be other times and occasions in the future that will bring more delight. So at this point, Thomas, thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you very much from right here in Frankfurt, where it's almost hotter than in Iraq, which is also quite rare.
Yeah, we spoke just weeks ago about how unbearable the situation is there. Well, it's good to have you back in Frankfurt.
Oh.
All right, so thank you very much, Thomas. And thank you, of course, as always at this point to you, our dear viewers. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to our channel, give it a thumbs up, and feel free to comment in our section below. And otherwise, we'd be truly delighted if you'd once again grant us your trust and your time for the next Mena-Watch talk, whenever that may be. Thank you so very much. Goodbye.
Mena-Watch, der unabhängige Nahost-Think Tank. Besuchen Sie auch unsere Website. Dort finden Sie täglich neue aktuelle Berichte und ausführliche wissenschaftlich fundierte Hintergrundanalysen zur Geschichte und Gegenwart der MENA-Region.